When the Ruhr Pocket was compressed into its final shape in April, dust, cinders, and broken girders of steel became a fixed backdrop. Prisoners of war accumulated in front of the wire, and in the 7 seconds after Erika Voss had just been counted among them, she was already moving at a rhythm that did not match anyone else around her. She walked more steadily than the others, stopped more precisely, her body moving as if along an invisible line. That line came from years of accumulated training in the Communications Auxiliary Corps. Reduce judgment to a minimum, react only when orders appeared. The American 104th Infantry Division's prisoner screening point did not carry any rhythm she recognized. The tents were arranged in a loose, irregular pattern. The planked walkways, hammered together in haste, tilted slightly. The formation of prisoners was so relaxed that it defied prediction. The first time Erika approached the screening area, she paused for a moment, that kind of instinctive alertness that came from drilled reflex. Orders had not disappeared. They had simply been replaced by a style she had never encountered before, hand gestures instead of shouted commands, movements loose yet precise, procedures smooth, but unconcerned with strict formation. This non-command rhythm could not be recited, could not be measured against a known pattern, and so she could only tighten her own movements, keeping herself as close as possible to the point of least deviation. A few seconds later, she was pushed into the slow-moving line of prisoners. On the table ahead lay a stack of unusually clean cotton towels, paper tissues, and simple metal tins of antibacterial ointment. The white of the towels was jarring against the grey air full of dust. Her gaze rested on it for only half a second before she pulled it back, preventing herself from showing any unnecessary interest in unfamiliar objects. Her body was rigid within the line, yet outwardly she seemed natural, just as her training had taught her. Do not rush, do not ask, do not judge, only execute. An American officer stood to one side. As he swept his eyes along the line of prisoners, he noticed her strides and her stance, a sharp contrast to the looseness everywhere else. His gaze lingered only briefly, yet that was long enough to form a kind of silent comparison. His own men had just completed a long-distance movement and were standing in a slouch, while the defeated enemy stood as if awaiting inspection. That contrast was caught by a young soldier standing near the medical table, a difference that could be perceived within the first 7 seconds. In that instant, the young soldier's interest was aroused. It was not hostility, but a kind of curiosity. Why did this person move like a mechanical device? He noticed that every time Erika stepped forward half a pace, her foot landed in exactly the same spot. Before the medic gestured for her to remove her boots, she had already shifted her position to avoid obstructing the person behind her. When the tissues were handed to her, her hand hesitated so slightly it was barely visible, like a system briefly pausing and then resuming. Any order given to her was compressed into the simplest possible action. No waste, no uncertainty, no excess. The sound of a Coca-Cola bottle placed on the table by a clerk rang out sharply, a clear note of glass against wood. The bottle, with its fine stream of bubbles in the brown liquid, stood in stark contrast to the dust at her feet. Erika's eyes flicked briefly across the bottle, then moved away at once, her expression calm yet wary. Her reaction was not fear, but the sensation of not knowing how to fit this object into any existing procedure. In those few seconds, the young soldier had already deciphered her operating pattern. She was someone trained until reaction had replaced judgment. In any moment, devoid of a direct order, her body would try to complete the logic on its own, searching for something to latch onto. The relaxed American rhythm did not provide her with such anchor points. The line moved on. She maintained her standard posture, as if guarding some invisible order in the midst of the makeshift chaos. The young soldier stood off to the side, watching her as if she were a program drawn too tight. At the very moment she turned and was led toward the barracks, a clear thought rose in his mind. If the rhythm around her was altered, would her entire way of functioning change with it? He did not act immediately, but the impulse to try it had already taken shape. He decided he would begin the next morning. Night fell quickly in the Ruhr Pocket. The prisoner tents had been thrown up in haste. Canvas flaps billowed softly in the wind, and from beyond the wire came the occasional reverberation of passing vehicles. The camp lights were not bright, but they were strong enough to keep all shapes distinct. On the first night, Erika Voss arranged her bunk in the practiced order dictated by years of training. She shook out the blanket, folded it into precise straight lines, set her shoes at the foot of the bed so the angles matched on both sides. Then she sat on the edge of the cot, waiting for the sound of night roll call to break the silence. But that night there was no bugle call, no shouted name list, only the short, steady footsteps of patrols passing over the mud, scraping faint tracks into the ground. She waited for several minutes, then kept on waiting, until the canvas walls swelled slightly in the night wind, proof that time was indeed moving forward rather than stopping altogether. The women prisoners around her had long since lain down. Someone coughed lightly, someone turned over. Someone's breathing settled into a stable rhythm. No punishment followed, and no orders were issued. In the end, she was forced to close her eyes in a night that had no clear signal of ending. The air of the next morning carried the damp weight of rain that had not entirely dried. Erika woke just before dawn, as she always did. That rhythm was buried deep in her nerves. The tent was quieter than it should have been. Several of the women were still asleep. She sat up, her body unconsciously waiting for the morning call to sound, but the camp remained still. She sat at the edge of the bed for a long time, as if waiting for an order that refused to arrive. In the end, she followed habit anyway. She straightened her bed, pressed the folds of the blanket into sharper lines, smoothed the weave, and then stood up. At the exact moment she rose, the young soldier was passing along the far side of the compound, a slightly crumpled stack of forms hanging from his hand. When he looked up, he saw her sit up, as if summoned by some invisible trumpet. His step slowed. This was precisely the phenomenon he had decided the night before to observe. He had cancelled the wake-up bugle just to see whether that program would still activate on its own. She had indeed woken, and had completed all her morning steps before he came into view. He walked on along his patrol route, his expression giving no hint of the faint, quiet satisfaction in his mind. He did not speak, did not stop. He simply continued his business. But in that moment, he confirmed his first conclusion. Even with the external rhythm removed, she would automatically fill the empty space. At breakfast, the prisoners were led to the serving point. The line was loose, but held its general direction. The soldiers stood along the path, watching each prisoner receive a metal tray. Once again, Erika executed her sequence of movements with precise consistency. Step forward, halt, left hand to take the tray, right hand to adjust it, half a step ahead. She needed no prompting, and behaved as if she had never noticed the disorder around her. The young soldier observed that she even anticipated the movements of the person in front, leaving a margin of space for them, as if every part of the process had been calculated in advance. It was then he began his second, dismantling action. On the table she would next pass, he deliberately moved the stack of cotton towels to the side she would least expect. Normally, the towels were placed on the right-hand side, near the prisoner's dominant hand, for convenience. The first time she had registered, she had silently taken the towel from that position and folded it into dimensions that would have passed a German inspection. This time, however, the young soldier moved them all to the left, piling them a little carelessly, even making the stack a different height than on the other tables. When her turn came, Erika noticed the deviation. The angle of the towels was different from the day before. The manner of stacking did not match her expectations. Her right hand moved automatically, then paused mid-air. The pause was slight, almost invisible, but enough for the young soldier to confirm his suspicion. Her actions depended on fixed trigger points, and when those points shifted, her rhythm suffered a brief break. The break lasted only half a second. She then took the towel with her other hand, still neatly, and folded it with even greater precision than the previous day, aligning each edge. The movement seemed like compensation, an unconscious attempt to restore the framework by reinforcing it. He noticed that too. Midday brought foot inspections. The medic indicated she should sit and loosen her laces. Her hands moved quickly. Her boots ended up toe to toe in a perfect line, though no one had commanded her to place them so. After the examination, the medic handed her the tin of antibacterial ointment and told her to use it as needed. The phrase contained no command structure at all. It was a completely permissive statement. When Erika took the metal tin, her body again paused, just slightly. The action had fallen into a category of awaiting further definition, but the medic had already turned toward the next prisoner. She was left to decide the amount, the exact spot, the manner of application. She spread a towel out across her knees, and according to the logic of her training, she cautiously re-established the boundaries. She gently pressed her fingers to the skin around the crack in her heel, carrying out a step that, in her former life, would have been defined by an explicit order. The young soldier watched from the rear as she moved, with a trace of hesitation but accurately. He saw her gaze travel between the prisoners and the Americans, as if searching for a model she could copy. But nothing around her held a single standard form. Some people were sitting, some standing, some reaching for tissues, others shifting freely in space. She had to decide on her own. All of this left a kind of silent tension in her movements. She did not disobey, but every moment of uncertainty was accumulating inside her. Before lunch, he began his third dismantling move, removing the clear signal to step forward from the registration line. Usually the prisoners would be sent up one by one with a simple gesture. This time the young soldier stood farther away, letting the line move on its own. He wanted to see what she would do if no explicit gesture was given. As soon as the prisoner in front of her finished and left, she stayed where she was. She did not step forward, did not inquire, as if waiting for the inevitable words, "next." A gap opened in the line before her, like a missing tile in a pattern. She stood perfectly straight, toes pressed lightly into the ground, unwavering. From 10 meters away, the young soldier watched the scene. Without a direct order, her program froze completely. At last he lifted his hands slightly, making a casual non-regulation gesture to beckon her forward. She moved at once, as though she had finally received permission to act. By the afternoon, as he passed the storage tent, he placed a Coca-Cola bottle deliberately in the middle of the registration table, just enough to block part of the writing area. When she reached the table and saw the bottle, she maneuvered carefully around it, turning the pencil sideways along its neck, keeping her handwriting neat and even, not allowing so much as an extra tilt. In that moment, the young soldier realized that she was not simply obeying discipline. She was striving to make the world align itself with her rhythm again. Even a bottle with no real significance could scramble the order of her motions. Before the day ended, he carried out his fourth disturbance. He cancelled the evening roll call entirely. He wanted to know whether, in the absence of a defined end signal, she would stand at the entrance again, waiting for orders to drop. The light faded. The breathing inside the tent grew slower and more regular. As he walked the perimeter of the compound, he saw the familiar shape of Erika, once more seated at the foot of her bed, upright and composed. This time, however, she did not stand at the flap. She remained where she was, as though weighing whether she should adhere to that procedure. In the end, she stayed seated. She did not go to the door. She did not wait deep into the night. Seeing this from a distance, the young soldier realized that, after only a day's worth of subtle actions, her rhythm had already begun to shift, slightly but genuinely. Tomorrow, he planned to push the rhythm further outward. On the third morning, the camp was quieter than on the previous 2 days. Rain had stopped just before dawn, leaving shallow pools in the mud along the edges of the tents. A thin mist drifted between the lines of wire, and the rumble of truck engines in the distance came and went. The rhythm of the camp felt looser than usual, almost purposefully slowed. This, too, was part of the young soldier's design. To make the experiment more obvious, he instructed the kitchen detail to delay the start of breakfast preparations, had the registration point open a few minutes late, and arranged for the head count patrol to take a longer route. For the camp as a whole, these delays were trivial. For Erika, they were a chain of missing beats. She still woke before full daylight, only to find that nothing in the camp was moving, not even footsteps. She sat on the edge of her cot, her body primed in a state of readiness, like a device waiting for a switch that refused to flip. The drawn-out time forced her movements to remain suspended. She was like a gear spinning in place. The other women woke one after another, Their movements were all different. One moved languidly, one shook out her blanket casually, another lay on her stomach using her fingers to comb through her hair. Erika watched those uneven rhythms as if she were seeing disorder erode a structure she had guarded for years. In the end, she stood and straightened her bunk again, pressed the blanket into a crisp line, placed her shoes at the precise angle at the foot of the bed. It was the only part of the morning she could truly control. When she emerged from the tent, she found that even the sentries were not yet at their posts. From a distance, the young soldier saw her standing at the entrance, upright and obviously earlier than anyone else. He did not walk up to her. He kept his distance and observed how she behaved within this slackened environment. She stood there for a full 2 minutes, as though waiting for an order that would never be spoken. At last, she simply joined a few of the already awake prisoners walking toward the serving point. Her stride was still regular, but now it clearly lacked reference points. She was forced to adjust repeatedly when someone ahead of her slowed or turned. Her movements became rigid and abrupt as she tried to keep pace. Now, the young soldier initiated the first deliberate disruption of the day. The line was stripped of any clear order of precedence. The utensils were set on a rough plank table. Under normal circumstances, the prisoners would have formed a loose queue. Today, no soldier bothered to maintain one. They hung around nearby, pretending to be busy, letting the prisoners approach however they liked. The line broke apart into an irregular wave. Some went first, some later, some faced the wrong way, others slipped into gaps. To most people, it was only a minor inconvenience. To Erika, it was a silent blow. She searched for a starting point, a direction, a reference line to align with. But every potential anchor kept shifting, never settling. Her steps became a pattern of stops and starts, like a program repeatedly encountering an error message. At one point she stepped back, deliberately letting others go ahead so she could see whether some familiar sequence would emerge. None did. From a few meters away, the young soldier saw her shoulders tremble faintly. It was not fear. It was the strain of someone trying too hard to maintain a structure. He kept his distance, allowing that pressure to build naturally. In the inspection phase that followed, he escalated the disturbance. He rearranged everything on the table, towels, tissues, ointment tins, and registration forms, into a different order from the previous days. Towels to the left, tissues to the right, ointment at the back of the table just out of easy reach, forms shifted away from the center line. For the others, it was only a change in layout. For Erika, it was as if the procedure had been split into 4 directions, stripping away all of her presets at once. As she reached the table, her movements faltered noticeably. Her right hand went out for the towel, only to find nothing there. She turned to the left instead, and was blocked by the tissues. When the medic asked her to note the severity of the crack in her heel, she instinctively tried to straighten the corners of the towels on the table first. In that short span of time, her actions came into conflict with each other. She struggled to bring a constantly shifting gauge back to level. The young soldier noticed her breathing becoming shallow, the tension in her fingers climbing up past her joints to her wrists. He gave a slight nod to the medic to keep to the process and not make any decisions on the prisoner's behalf. Then he introduced the core disruption of the day. The line disappeared entirely. Where previously the prisoners had formed a natural queue as they waited to register, now he let them all walk toward whichever table was nearest. The result was several streams of bodies flowing at once, moving in different directions like small boats drifting on the surface of a river. Erika froze at the sight. She stood between 2 intersecting paths, as if searching for the correct line hidden in the confusion. She lifted her head several times, then lowered it to look at her own boots, her body leaning forward and back as though waiting for some clear command to define who went first and who followed. No such definition came. At one point, trying to move ahead, she collided with another prisoner. The impact was not hard, but it was enough to startle her into raising an arm, a motion very close to a defensive block. In a military setting, it might easily have been interpreted as the prelude to an attack. A few soldiers noticed but did not misread it. What they saw was not aggression, but a reflex brought on by extreme tension. No one intervened. Only the young soldier continued to watch from a distance. He was not seeking a confrontation. He wanted the stress in her rigid structure to reveal the beginning of its collapse. In the afternoon, he pushed his experiment to the most visible point. At the registration table, as the medic inspected her foot, she tried to anticipate his movements. Unable to predict precisely when he would turn back, she lifted her foot too soon, disrupting the sequence of the examination. When the medic returned to her, her foot was in the wrong position. Realizing that her rhythm had gone out of step, she tried to correct it, but the effort of fixing two misaligned actions left her plainly flustered. Reaching for the stack of tissues, she used too much force, sending the whole bundle sliding off the table and onto the ground. It was the first visible sign of her losing control in 3 days. She bent down at once to gather them, moving so quickly that she almost dropped to her knees, driven by an urgent need to restore order. Her hands trembled over the scattered papers, yet she still stacked each sheet neatly, smoothing them, pressing them into a precise pile, as if she could repair some damaged internal mechanism through this act. From a few steps away, the young soldier saw all of it clearly. She was trying to salvage an important structure that no longer existed. In that moment he understood. Her discipline was not made of steel. It was made of something brittle. When she straightened up, her breathing was uneven, her chest rising and falling visibly. She set the tissues back on the table at an almost perfect angle, as if proving to some invisible superior that she was still qualified. For a heartbeat, there was no hostility in her eyes, only a deep fatigue, the exhaustion of someone who had spent 3 days maintaining an internal order at the cost of her own strength. At dusk, as the light faded, she finally reached her threshold. The line was forming for the evening meal. The prisoner beside her was walking too slowly, forcing her habitual pace to slacken. That slight lag threw her off. She came to a sudden halt, her left foot lifting but not settling, as if caught in an argument with her own body. A second later she raised her eyes, fixing the person in front with a stare as though trying to force them back into the proper speed. They did not notice. Her movements fell into conflict again, foot rising, dropping, then rising once more, like a mechanical component jammed in mid-rotation. This time, the young soldier had to intervene. He approached her and stopped at a careful distance, close enough that she could feel his presence, not so close that it became pressure. He gave no commands, no instructions. He simply stood there. Only then did she slowly place her foot back on the ground. Her breathing regained its steady rhythm, but her face held unmistakable weariness. For the first time in 3 days, her body moved not for the sake of carrying out an order, but because it could no longer bear the weight of holding the structure together. When the sun finally went down, she barely realized that she had already sat down instead of waiting at the door for a roll call that would never come. Her posture was still upright, but the rigidity had been stripped away, leaving something smoothed by friction, like a piece of metal that had finally been allowed to slacken by a fraction. The young soldier stopped a few meters away and watched her for a few seconds. From where he stood, he could see that Erika had developed her first real fracture, not in the cracked skin of her heel, but in her programming. And once a crack appears, change will seep in through that opening. As night settled, the temperature in the camp dropped quickly. Canvas rubbed against itself in the wind, sending out a faint trembling sound, like a loop of background noise quietly replaying. 3 days of tightness left Erika feeling briefly weightless as she sat down. Her hands remained neatly folded on her knees, but the pressure at her fingertips was no longer uniform. For the first time, she did not stand outside when there was no end-of-day signal, and she did not try to uphold any unassailable order. She sat firmly, but not as someone ready to rise at any moment. Her shoulders had dropped slightly. The tension in her spine eased in silence, like a taut string finally relaxing by a single notch. The breathing around her, the footsteps between tents, the occasional cough, all of it fused into a background loop she had seldom allowed herself to register in such a way. No one had ordered her to release her tension. It simply began to unwind on its own. The next morning, she did not wake at the exact instant before dawn. Something in her fixed internal rhythm had been broken. It was the sound of a few prisoners moving outside the tent that finally woke her, not a bugle, not a preset inner alarm, but an ordinary disturbance in an ordinary environment. When she sat up, her movements were not sluggish, but the compulsory snap of immediately falling into position was gone. One corner of the blanket had slipped out of its fold when she got up. Normally, she would have smoothed it at once, returning it to perfection. This time her hand stopped in mid-air. She let the crease remain, 1 second, then another. Eventually she did smooth it, but the gesture was gentler than before, lacking the mechanical precision she once insisted upon. This subtle difference echoed again and again in the camp routines that day. On her way to breakfast, she no longer tried to maintain exact equal distance with the people before and behind her. She still avoided collisions, but she did not force every step into an ideal measure. There was a faint going with the flow in her stride, as if she were following others rather than pushing herself forward against an invisible metric. The young soldier noticed. He did not increase the disturbances this time. He let the camp settle into something more like ordinary life. The placement of items remained variable, but no longer deliberately contradictory. The line still lacked explicit commands, but its flow was smoother. He wanted to see whether, in the absence of further pressure, she would continue to loosen. The answer came quickly. The loosening did not need to be forced. It had been building within the cracks for days. During the foot check, she did not wait for the medic to step aside before repositioning her foot. She moved ahead of the process by a fraction, extending her leg so the inspection continued in a natural line. When the medic turned away briefly to grab a tool, she did not overreact or misalign her posture. She simply shifted slightly to one side, making space. When the ointment was passed to her, there was no hesitation, no tiny freeze. She accepted it and applied it with smoother, softer movements around the crack in her heel. Wiping with a tissue, she did not re-flatten the corners, did not force the sheet into a perfectly square shape. She let the paper crease and crumple in her fingers. That small, unremarkable scrap of tissue, which she had so often aligned to a regulation neatness, now bore the ordinary wrinkles of use. To anyone else, it was nothing. To her, it was a minor but tangible release. The most visible change came at the registration table. In the past, she would wait for a clearly defined signal to move. Even if the line shifted on its own, she would remain still until someone addressed her. Today, when the prisoner in front left, she stepped forward. The motion was natural, almost casual, as if she had simply followed the space opening up before her. The young soldier saw it and felt a flicker of surprised recognition. It was the first time she had filled the empty space on her own. His observation was soon confirmed. When asked to mark the severity of the crack in her heel, she paused at the edge of the form, letting her eyes rest on the blank box. She inspected her own foot, then wrote down a number. The handwriting was still neat and even, but it had lost its purely mechanical quality. The stroke of the pencil was for the sake of describing the fact, not just for the sake of fulfilling a rule. Standing a few steps away, he watched her place the form back on the table. The way she let it go was not the completion of a task so much as the closing of a daily routine, done not only because she was required to do it, but because she chose to complete it. He knew then that the external disturbances were no longer necessary. Her rhythm had shifted from being defined from outside to being generated from within. She no longer depended on orders, and structural changes no longer split her apart. In the afternoon, she was formally assigned to the temporary women's prisoner compound. A number was written on a small card and slipped into her file. The folder itself was thin, only a few pages: name, unit, health status, crack severity in the heel, and among those entries, one figure in her own handwriting. When she took the file, her fingers pressed lightly against the edge of the paper. The sheet bowed a little, catching a strip of sunlight along its curve. She did not flatten the documents into perfect alignment. She simply tucked the folder under her arm and followed the others deeper into the camp. The light at the end of the path was faint but clear. A narrow gap in the canvas let in a thin band of brightness that fell exactly at her feet. When she stepped into it, she did not think about which foot should land first. She did not scan the formation for a point to align herself to. Her boot left a single unremarkable print in the firmer mud. It was the first time since her capture that she had walked to her own beat. The young soldier stood inside the wire, watching her back recede into the distance. He did not call out to her or signal in any way. His attention withdrew from her and returned to the everyday tasks of the camp. The change was complete. It no longer needed his intervention. Wind rose from the far side of the compound, lifting one corner of her uniform jacket. She did not notice. She simply moved forward, her steps measured but unhurried, matching the rhythm of the camp without being ruled by it. In the closing lines of her story there was no defining event, no symbolic turning point, no sudden revelation. The transformation had already finished its work in countless, nearly invisible acts, in a stride no longer forced into perfect symmetry, in paper no longer smoothed to rigidity, in breathing that did not wait for a signal, in movements that no longer sought permission. She had begun to move in a rhythm she had never been taught. When the fifth morning came, the light over the camp was fogged and pale. Mist drifted toward the wire under the morning breeze. The air still carried the chill of the night's rain. Erika woke when her breathing found its own balance. Her body stretched before her mind had fully surfaced, her movements slow, freed from the precise beats of any internal clock. Sitting up, she did not at once make the bed. She put her feet on the ground first, sensing the damp that lingered in the packed earth. That silent, uncommanded pause had been rare in her life. Only after that did she fold the blanket. The folds were straight and orderly, but no longer bore the weight of compulsion. A faint horizontal crease remained near the corner where the fabric had slipped earlier. She saw it and let it stay. It was a harmless imperfection. She laced her shoes and stepped outside. The path was already dotted with people moving in various directions, but the formations were as loose as always. She did not search for a fixed place for herself among those footsteps. She followed the walkway in a natural line. Her pace, visible in the shallow shadows cast by the morning light, was steady, but no longer in the mechanical sense. The breakfast area was calmer than in previous days. The clatter of metal trays was dampened by the cool air, and the camp's tempo had settled into something stable and quiet. The young soldier stood near the serving line and saw her approach. Her movements were composed. There was no frantic attempt to rebuild structure, no frozen wait for permission. He noticed one small thing. When she reached the serving table, she did not look for a gesture from the guards, did not check whether the others were aligned. She simply took the tray that was handed to her, inclined her head slightly, and walked away. In any other prisoner, it would have been nothing. In her, it meant a deep internal fracture had taken on a new, coherent form. The screening routines went on. The medic sat behind the familiar desk, recording each day's foot conditions. When she stepped up, she did not wait for his command. She slipped into the open space in the line, sat down, removed her boots, extended her leg so the light fell clearly on the crack in her heel. By the time the medic handed her a tissue, her hand was already open to receive it. There was no longer that narrow band of tension. In its place was a measured, unforced coordination. The tissue curved naturally between her fingers. She did not straighten it. She wiped as the paper bent with her grip, the motion neither rushed nor ritualized. It looked like a rhythm learned from ordinary life and slowly rooted in her own body. At the form, she paused at the edge of the page and took up the pencil. The paper that had been lifted by the wind the day before was flat again, but she did not correct its alignment. Her attention stayed on the empty field in front of her. She looked briefly at the sole of her foot, gauged the wound, and wrote down a number. The handwriting was balanced, controlled. Behind it was not the stiff uniformity of training, but the steadiness of personal judgment. The young soldier watched from 3 meters away as she placed the form back down. The way she set it on the table did not belong to a person simply following a sequence. It belonged to someone completing something she had accepted as part of her day. He understood then that he no longer had any role to play in her adjustment. The orders and the disturbances, the experiments and the small provocations, they had done their work. Her movement now came from a different source. That afternoon, the process of counting and registering prisoners proceeded as usual. Her file remained thin, containing only what needed to be there: basic facts, routine assessments. Among them, one small number was written in her own hand. In the camp, nothing dramatic marked the end of that process. No one proclaimed that Erika Voss had changed. No signal announced a transition. The day folded into evening as always. Yet somewhere in that unnoticed stretch of time, the woman who once moved like a piece of tightly wound machinery had begun to walk, stand, and breathe at a pace that was no longer dictated by command. Discipline had given her a shape to cling to in the ruins of defeat. In the loosened weave of captivity, she gradually learned something simpler: the ability to stand upright without awaiting an order, to walk without calculating every step, to breathe without listening for a signal. Her story carried no grand conclusion. Only an image remained: a member of a German communications auxiliary unit, captured toward the end of the war, walking through an enemy camp at a speed of her own choosing, stepping calmly toward the next small strip of light.